you are. I got the power. It is 9:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming to this year's State of the Church address. Many of you may remember that the first State of the Church address was held in November of 2021. We had initially planned to do the second this past November, but then decided that the new year is really a good time to have this kind of address, this kind of time for us to kind of touch base with one another, kind of look back and look ahead. And so that's why the State of the Church this year is in January, and we will plan to do this next January as well. As some perhaps are still on their way, and as a good way for us to enter into this time together, we're going to stand and sing the first three verses of hymn 57, "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing." As most of you have heard me say, this is the Methodist national anthem, so you shouldn't even need the hymnal, but by all means feel free to stand and to grab a hymnal and to sing, "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing." Oh, for a thousand together. God, the psalmist said that you have been our dwelling place in every generation. Before the mountains were brought forth, before you founded the earth, established the earth from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We enter into a time of reflection together this morning. We enter into a time of prayer, remembering, God, that you have been and will be our dwelling place, our safe place, our harbor, our shelter in every generation. In your presence, we find comfort. In your presence, we find joy. In your presence, we find strength. And we rejoice to gather in your presence this morning, O God. We give thanks for your faithfulness to us in the past and your faithfulness yet ahead. We entrust ourselves to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Please be seated. So in August of 1805, the Corps of Discovery, otherwise known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, at long last, after 15 months of difficult travel, arrived at the headwaters of the Missouri River. This really was the sort of principal object of their journey of discovery. They had been charged with finding the Northwest Passage. Many of you know this story. You're familiar with this story. But for centuries, European nations and then the young nation of America had assumed, had believed, had been absolutely sure that there would be a waterway connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Mississippi River. It just had to be found. It was out there somewhere. They called it the Northwest Passage. And so Lewis and Clark and their team were sent by President Jefferson to explore the Louisiana Purchase, just made by the United States from the Empire of France. Vast tract of land in the middle of what is now our nation. They were sent to explore the Louisiana Purchase, but also to find the Northwest Passage. People had been looking for that. Nations had been searching for it. They knew it was there, and they knew that whoever discovered it would receive power and wealth. The wealth of this continent would flow to them, and with that wealth would come power. It would be, as one person has said, like owning the internet. All of the traffic connecting the Pacific to the Mississippi, those trade networks would make the nation that discovered the Northwest Passage, fabulously wealthy and unbelievably powerful. And so the plan all along had been to go up the Mississippi to the Missouri, the Great River Missouri, and then to find eventually the source of the Missouri, and then they assumed there'd be a way, either a waterway or a short portage by land from the source of the Missouri to the Columbia River, which would then go on to the Pacific Ocean. And so after 15 months of travel, Lewis and Clark had finally arrived at the headwaters of the Missouri. The Missouri split off into 3 channels. There was some debate about which of those streams was the stream from which all other streams flowed. And so then eventually they did arrive at the source, the spring from which the mighty Missouri flowed. 15 months of personal searching, centuries of questioning on the part of European powers, and now the young American nation had arrived at this moment. Meriwether Lewis was absolutely certain that once he had drunk from the cool waters of that small spring, he would ascend a small rise and behold the Columbia, a relatively short distance, an easy portage away. They would carry their canoes over that brief distance, drop them in the Columbia, and then coast downhill to the Pacific Ocean. They did not, of course, see the Columbia River a short portage, a short distance away. Instead, what they saw was this. Anthony, if you would. The Rocky Mountains. What they discovered, much to their chagrin and really sort of, consternation, was there is no Northwest Passage. There's no water route connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Mississippi River. There's no short portage. There's no relatively easy and brief hike with their canoes on their backs. Instead, what you have is the Rocky Mountains, mountains like they had never seen. And so they came to the conclusion, the irresistible conclusion, that the world before them was not at all like the world behind them. The world before them was not the world that they had imagined. They thought the western half of the country would be a lot like the eastern half of the country. The eastern half, it kind of rose gently upward, and they believed that once it would flow gently downward, that, going upstream had been a little bit difficult, but now the hardest part of their journey was behind them. They'd cross that short land bridge joining them to the Columbia River, and then they'd get in their canoes and they would just coast downhill to the Pacific Ocean. They realized that their mental map was all wrong, and like it or not, the world before them was not at all as expected, not at all like the world behind them, and canoes that had gotten them there would get them no farther. This is really an image for this particular moment in the history of our country, in the life of the church in the Western world. Todd Bolsinger has written this book, which you are going to get to know, called Canoeing the Mountains. And Todd Bolsinger has written that the story of the Corps of Discovery is the driving metaphor for our present moment in history. In every field, in every business, every organization, leaders are rapidly coming to the awareness that the world in front of us is radically different from everything behind us. The world in front of us is radically different from everything behind us. Well, what does that mean? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking this morning about the world in front of us, which really is not the world you expected. It's not the world we expected, and yet there it is. And then we'll talk a bit about where we go from here. What Lewis and Clark were really faced with is going off the map into uncharted territory. They were at a moment where either they could turn back. They could just say, hey, sorry, no Northwest Passage, we're going home. Or they could press on and continue exploring, continue discovering, continue charting this land that the country had recently purchased, find out what they could. But they didn't go back. They went forward, but they went forward off the map. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about this world in front of us. And you can see that I've actually, if you would throw that back up, Anthony, 3 sort of key things for us to consider. The world before us, the world in front of us, is post Christendom, and we've talked a little bit about this before, and I won't spend too much more time on that. It is post-pandemic. We're not really post-pandemic, but the post-pandemic world is emerging, and we have some sense of what we're looking at there. And it's also, for us, increasingly a post-separation world, which has to do with the splintering in the United Methodist Church. So I want to spend a few minutes on each one of those. First of all, post-Christendom. Sometimes people refer to our culture as post-Christian, and I don't really think that's accurate. It is, however, post-Christendom. Christendom is a word that scholars use, more and more non-scholars use as well, to describe the Western world for the last 1,700 years. When the Roman Emperor Constantine became Christian, stopped the persecution of Christians, the Christian faith became increasingly dominant in Roman culture and Western life. That religious dominance of Christianity continued past the fall of Rome and into the Middle Ages and into the world of the Renaissance and into the modern world. And so most, you all grew up, almost everyone here, not everyone, but almost everyone here grew up in a world that felt Christian, that thought in Christian terms. You could easily assume and rightfully assume that the vast majority of your neighbors were Christians, self-identified Christians. They may not have been church-going, but they would self-identify as Christian. Most often the question was not, if you had new neighbors, new people move into your neighborhood or onto your street, the question was not, are they Christian, but what kind of Christian? Right? Protestant or Catholic? And then if they were Protestant, the question was, Methodist. Well, in the South, it was Methodist or Baptist. Right? Those were the choices. Right? In the North, where I grew up, it was Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, and on and on and on. We had every flavor. Same thing with the Catholic side, actually. It was Italian Catholic, Eastern, Serbian Catholic, German Catholic. It was kind of, they had the range of options there as well. So that was a world in which many of you were born and in which you were raised. To live in a post-Christendom world is to live in the world in which we now live, where Christian faith, Christianity is no longer the dominant religious presence. It's no longer assumed by all of your neighbors. It's not present in public spaces in the way that it was. Some of you have heard me talk before about a member of the first church that I served, Fern Wisser, who was a one-room school teacher. She had the one-room schoolhouse, and it was a public school, and she would do as many of your teachers did, right? She'd begin the day with a reading from the Bible, and then lead the children in the Lord's Prayer. And people just why wouldn't you do that? Well, it's difficult to do that in a public school when not all the children are Christian. Some are Jewish, some are Hindu, some are Muslim, some are Sikh, some are raised in atheist homes or agnostic homes, and so there's a religious diversity present now in greater sort of numbers than has really existed here before. So that's part of it. So in any event, so that's the post-Christendom world in which we are now living as a church, going forward as a church. We can talk some more about that, but I want to move on to the post-pandemic world, because we are, of course, living in a world post-pandemic, or this emerging sort of post-pandemic world. There are a couple key features that I think are really important for us. Some of you have heard me say before last summer that the pandemic was an accelerant. That's not a word that I used or I invented, but others have. That it really acted like an accelerant to speed up the pace of change. And in many ways, it just simply accelerated trends that had already emerged in the life of our country and in the life of most churches. It just sped them up. So a couple things to note. Post-pandemic, the polling consistently shows that the vast majority of churches lost 30% of their active members during the pandemic. 30% of the people who were active in your church, you saw them in worship on a regular basis. They were involved in things beyond the weekly service. They gave consistently to support the ministries of your church. 30%. I'm not talking about membership on paper. I'm talking about active participants in the life of your church. The vast majority of churches have lost 30% of their active participants from before the pandemic. They left, and they're not coming back for a variety of reasons. That's consistent. As you can well imagine, there's a financial impact to the loss of 30%. Now, for us here at Canon, of course, we didn't just have the pandemic, we have what some of you have called the candemic, the pre-pandemic crisis in the life of our church, during which you lost half your people, half your income, and at least half, and from what I've been told, more than half of your volunteers. You were just starting to figure out who you were on the other side of that crisis when COVID hit. So you've got the double whammy. I want to say very briefly, we don't need to keep revisiting that season in the life of this church, but we are affected by that season in the life of this church. It does not have to define us, but it does still affect us. Like, that's part of the reality. It does not have to define us. That doesn't have to be who we are. And if you think about it, it wasn't who you've been. Like, that wasn't your history. You didn't do that. It was unprecedented. It was an anomaly. So that makes it a little easier for you to move on. One of my previous appointments, I will not tell you which church, it was not the one I served right before this one, but their history, they had a history of fighting. And one of the guys who'd been in that church for like 30 years, but it wasn't his home church, told me that on his first Sunday, he walked in the sanctuary and turned right and sat down, and he said, I didn't realize when I sat down on the right-hand side, I was picking sides. Like, it was literally us versus them. They had a history of fighting. They were miserable together. They would never miss a Sunday, but they gathered in tension and animosity. That was their history, right? Not your history. So anyway, but you're still affected by that, right? Not defined by it, but affected by it, and so that impact is there. Another dynamic that churches, almost everyone is seeing, is a significant decline in volunteers. And I was in a meeting with other pastors of larger membership churches this week, and to a person, and I'm talking like 40 senior pastors of larger membership churches, they all said, we can't keep staff. Thank God we don't have that problem. We've actually been able to hire. They're struggling to hire. I didn't brag about that, but I quietly was very thankful for that. They have a hard time keeping staff, and they can't get volunteers. Like, that's a dynamic, and some of you may know what that's like. There's a hesitation on the part of many of the people to jump back into what they had done, to commit to something long-term, right? We're kind of reevaluating our life choices, our rhythms. We don't want to schedule ourselves into a constant state of overwhelm. So I understand that, but that's also a challenge for churches, right? Because we're also in this moment where we've got a 30% reduction in active people and another reduction in giving, and we cannot staff the way we have. So we actually need more volunteers, and we actually have less. That's the reality of the post-pandemic church. In addition, many of those who are engaged, who are involved, are engaged online. Some, that was and remains their best option for engagement. They may have moved out of the area, or for health reasons, it's not good for them to come, or for schedule reasons, they can't come. But for others, for other lifestyle reasons, they have chosen to engage online, and that is their new norm. That became their new norm. That remains their new norm. And I'm very grateful that people can engage with us in that way. It does create some new dynamics, right? We got to figure out how to be community when we're not all gathered physically together in the same space. We're here and we're there. That's part of the dynamic of the post-pandemic world in which we now live and minister. Finally, post-separation. And this is ongoing. Many of you have heard me describe what's happening to the United Methodist Church, and I'm quoting others. I did not come up with this, but it's not a split, it is a splintering. I think that's an important distinction. We have had church splits in the past. The Methodist Episcopal Church, predecessor denomination, split formally and officially, a negotiated divorce before the Civil War. We split into the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South over the issue of slavery. And so that's an actual split where you like sit down and you negotiate the division of property, and you sort it out how that's actually gonna work. That's a split. What we have right now, of course, is a splintering. Churches and pastors and people are leaving. Some are leaving to join a more conservative denomination. Some are leaving to join more liberal denominations. Some are leaving to be community churches, non-denominational churches. And so that's the splintering. You know, it's not neat, it's not negotiated, it's ongoing. And it's painful. We have a lot of separations. We have a lot of divorces. And that's going to keep happening over the next couple years. And so I've begun to think of it in terms of splintering, separating, and sorting. We are living through the splintering, right? And so that brings with it a lot of separating. Congregations we know will choose to leave the United Methodist Church. People we know will choose to leave the United Methodist Church. And then that has begun to bring about and will bring about sorting, which is to say, a church, you know, I know personal examples of this, right? Churches decide, 2/3 of the professing members decide we need to leave the United Methodist Church, we want to leave the United Methodist Church, and so they do. What about the 1/3 that did not want to leave? Some will stay, but others will leave. They'll find a church that wants to remain United Methodist. The other works, and the reverse works as well. Churches will choose to stay United Methodist, and some members would really rather not remain United Methodist, and so they will leave and find a church that is not United Methodist. Maybe it's Global Methodist, maybe it's independent. So there's going to be this sorting where people kind of find new church homes inside and outside the United Methodist Church. That is part of the painful reality through which we are living. It is awkward, it's unavoidable, it's ongoing. So there you go. Aren't you excited to be confronted with a post-Christendom, post-pandemic, post-separation world? You know, I am sure that Meriwether Lewis's heart sank when he looked up and saw the Rocky Mountains. They had been catching glimpses of them before they were unavoidably confronted by them. I find this fascinating, right? They caught glimpses of them. And they had heard stories, like the Shoshone and other native peoples had told them, like, there are these great mountains, but they didn't want to believe it. They were sure that they would find the source of the Missouri, and then hop, skip, and a jump, they would drop their canoes into the Columbia River and coast home to the Pacific Ocean. So they had hints, they had glimpses, they heard stories, but eventually they could not ignore, could not deny, yeah, okay, our eyes are not deceiving us, no one was lying to us, those are huge mountains, and there's no way a canoe will help us get over them. So we're going to have to drop the canoes, we've been boatsmen, we're going to have to become mountaineers. We've never done this before. So, Todd Bolsinger, again in Canoeing the Mountains, has written, and this is the word of hope for us, the church at its best has always been a core of discovery. The church at its best has always been a core of discovery. This particular moment in time, this off the map into uncharted territory season in the life of the church brings tons of anxiety, lots of fear, but it's also filled with unbelievable opportunities. an invitation, I believe, from God to rediscover what it means to be the church and to be church again in new and fresh and also old ways. The church at its best has always been a core of discovery. I want to remind you of a couple passages. The first is from Genesis 12. It's the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 12. If you've never heard this before, I want to point out to you that these 3 verses are the hinge on which the entire Bible turns. Everything before it, the 11 chapters before it, lead up to it. And everything after it flow from it. Without the promise of God, the promises of God in these 3 verses, there would be no Israel, there would be no Jesus, there would be no Holy Spirit, there'd be no church. Kid you not, these 3 verses are the key to the entire Bible. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Blessed, 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 blessing. This comes after curse, cursed, cursed, cursed. In other words, God created all things and called them good, and they were good, and God blessed the animals and said, "Be fruitful and multiply," and he made humankind in his image and blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and rule over it," right? Blessing, 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 blessing. And then Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God cursed the serpent and the ground. And then we have words of judgment that follow, right? All hell is unleashed. And things go from bad to worse. In Genesis 3, you have Adam and Eve eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in Genesis 4, you have the first murder. And it goes downward from there, right? So Genesis 12 is the turning point. It's the pivot point, where the God who created all things and called them good promises to make all things good again. And the first step is what? Go. And God underlines how challenging this will be. Go from your land and your kindred and your father's house. Go from everyone you know and everything that you have known to the land I will show you. Isn't that wonderful? I'll show you. Like, you go first, then I'll show you where you're going. Leave behind the world you have known. Go to the land that I will show you. I'll make you a great nation. I'll make your name great. And through you, and this is the promise that gets us Jesus, through you, through your family, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. But it starts with that commandment. It starts with that invitation, go. Right? Abram had to go into what for him was uncharted territory. At that point, he's living in Haran, kind of Assyria, northern Mesopotamia, and he's supposed to go to the land of Canaan. He's heard of that, but he's never been there. It's not home. All right, so then, beginning of the New Testament, the end of Matthew's gospel, the risen Jesus came to them and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Jesus is speaking to his apostles. They're all Jews. They're all Palestinian Jews. They're all from Galilee and Judea. Have any of them ever been outside the Holy Land? Have any of them ever been to Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece? No. But to them he says, go. I'm going with you. You're going with my authority. You're going to go and make disciples of all nations. All those families that God promised to bless through the family of Abraham will now be blessed through you as you go. Right? And then at the beginning of the book of Acts, we read the risen Jesus told his disciples, told his apostles, told his followers that once the Holy Spirit came upon them and they were empowered for ministry, they would be his witnesses in Jerusalem where they were, in Judea, the local neighborhood, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. The church at its best has always been a core of discovery. Has always been on the way, on the go, taking the gospel, the good news about Jesus, to people who haven't heard, who don't know the love of God. That's our mission. That's our calling. That's the adventure. That's the challenge. That's the opportunity that comes with this moment of awkwardness and anxiety and uncertainty and fear. We get to rediscover what it means to be a church on the way. So, despite the challenges, there is this invitation, there is this opportunity. And so I believe, and this is really kind of the heart of the presentation today, what I want you to take away, if you take away nothing else, it is this. This is our year to go off the map into uncharted territory. This is the year for us to go off the map into uncharted territory. So what does that mean? Well, a few things actually. 3 things, and these are the leadership lessons from Lewis and Clark. I'll talk briefly about each of them, and I will leave time for questions and comments at the end. The leadership lessons from them are let go, learn as we go, and keep going. Let go, in their case, meant they had to let go of their canoes, right? They could not insist on taking their canoes with them over the Rocky Mountains. What got them to that place, what got them to that point was good, was helpful, but it was only helpful to a point. What got them there wouldn't get them going forward, right? So they had to let go of some of what they had done, some of what they knew. I was perfectly trained to serve as a pastor in a world that no longer exists. Right? So the letting go begins with me. The letting go begins with me. I was trained to pastor churches in a world that no longer exists. In Christendom, pastors, their basic job description was to preach and teach, provide pastoral care, and administer, the business side of the church. 3 fundamental, and those responsibilities have not disappeared, right? But in Christendom, you can assume once again that your neighbors are Christian and they are looking for a church. The only question is, what kind of church? You go back to the 50s, there was tremendous brand loyalty, and so you'd find out if your new neighbors were Methodist or Baptist, right? People went looking for a church. They usually went looking for their church, right? And then the shift that took place in the 70s and the 80s was people began looking for specific types of programming. Right? So then you're competing. It's not about brand loyalty anymore. It's about competition with programming for children and for youth. But the basic approach was pretty much the same. If you build it, they will come. Right? If you've got good music, good preaching, good children and youth programming, they will come because they're already looking for a church. And so, it's taken me a while to realize that I was trained to serve a world, to serve churches in a world that really has passed and is passing. This is why a lot of pastors retire early now. Right? Because they don't want to retool. I'm an increasingly old dog, but I can learn some new skills. Abram was 75 years old when God called him to go. Right? But this is a real dynamic. I've seen this among clergy, is that they just say, look, I'm done. I don't have the energy to retool, to retrain. So I have to learn some new ways of being pastor. Todd Bolsinger tells a powerful story about they had put together this new service to reach younger people. He was going to preach at the first service, the launch service for this new venture. And right before he went on to preach, he heard God say to him, "They need you to lead more than they need you to preach." And he said, that's a hard word to hear when you're about to preach. Right? But he learned, like, there are some skills I don't have that I need to acquire. They need me to lead in different ways. Like, in Christendom, pastors basically led from the pulpit. And that remains important. That remains central, but that's not enough. And I know that, so I got to learn some new things. So I'm going to have to let go of some of how I've done pastoral ministry and learn some new things. We will also have to let go of some stuff, right? Like, some of what has worked in the past, we're not saying it didn't work then, we're just saying it probably won't work now. And really, every facet of the life of the church, we have to kind of think about that. What do we need to let go of? What's just not effective anymore? And we can be angry about that. We can be bitter about that. We can blame our neighbors and about that. We can blame our pastor about that. But the reality is, some of what worked no longer does, because the landscape has changed. So there's some letting go that has to take place. And we do need to learn as we go. The reality is that it's helpful to say, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, that's what most of us as pastors have been saying for the last several years. I don't know. I don't know what I'm seeing. I'm not quite sure where do we go from here. What worked before is not working now, and so we kind of have to learn. And we have to experiment. So that's when I say that this will be the year we go off the map. It means we're going to try some things. We're going to do some adventuring. We're going to do some experimenting. Some of what we'll try will be effective and fruitful, and some of what we will try will flop. That doesn't mean it's a failure. It means we learned something, right? So we win or we learn. That's all we do. We win or we learn. I'm reminded, my kids are in sports, and one of them puts a lot of pressure on himself to perform at a peak level all the time and never make mistakes. And we have to constantly remind him, it's practice. None of your coaches are expecting perfection. That's why you have practice. Attitude and effort, right? Getting better. Progress, not perfection. Progress, not perfection. And that's a lot of what we will do, right? We'll learn as we go. Couple stories from the Bible that for me just seemed like so much the word for this moment. The Apostle Paul and his team come to Philippi, right? This was the first church in Europe, Macedonia. He's been in Asia Minor. That's the world he knew best. Now he's in Philippi. To this point, everywhere Paul has gone, he's begun a new church, planted a new church by he goes to two places, synagogue and the marketplace. And because in Asia Minor, in the Eastern Roman Empire, there are Jews everywhere, and Paul's really smart. He goes to these hub cities, right? Because if he plants a church there, then it will plant churches and it will spread through the countryside. So he's going to focus where he can have the biggest impact. Hub cities, there are always synagogues in hub cities because the Jewish people are scattered, right? And so he goes to the synagogue because he wants his fellow Jews to know that Jesus is their Messiah, the anointed one of God, the great David's greater son. He wants them to know. He wants them to hear the gospel. Plus, he knows there will be God-fearing Gentiles in each of those synagogues. Non-Jewish people who have come to worship Israel's God, they believe that there is only one God, and that God has revealed himself to the people of Israel, and they've come to worship that God in the synagogue. They have not become Jews, but they have become believers, and as best as they can, as Gentiles in their walk of life, they seek to love God, the God of Israel, with all of their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love their neighbors as themselves. That moral code is part of what has drawn them to worship this God. They did not hear that, never heard that in any pagan temple. It was only in the synagogues. So Paul goes there to proclaim the gospel to his fellow Jews and to reach God-fearing people who already knew about the God of Israel, who already knew the law and the prophets and the Psalms. Like, he's working with people who speak his language. Now he's in Philippi. No synagogue, because there aren't enough Jews. You got to have 10 Jewish men to have a synagogue. They don't have 10. And so what does he do? He finds a river because he figures if there are any Jews and God-fearers in Philippi, on the Sabbath, they'll go to a river. They'll get near a body of water, and they'll pray. And so that's where he meets people in Philippi. Right? Same mission, to preach the gospel, make disciples of Jesus Christ. But if Paul had waited for a synagogue in Philippi, he would have been waiting forever. He had to adapt. He had to change. Athens, after that, is a whole other ballgame. There's not even a place of prayer by a river. He doesn't intend to plant a church in Athens. He's waiting for some friends when he looks at all the temples everywhere around him, and he ends up going to the Areopagus on Maris Hill because that's where people go to discuss and debate the great questions of the ages and the great questions of the day. And so he preaches the gospel on Mars Hill to philosophers and skeptics and others, right? So his eyes are always fixed on his mission to preach the gospel, proclaim that Jesus, the crucified, resurrected, reigning, returning Messiah of Israel, is the true Lord of all. He proclaims that gospel, makes disciples everywhere he goes, but how he does that continues to change. He adapts. He evolves. He innovates. Right? So he learned as he went. So that's a big part of our journey. We're gonna learn. And so a couple of things there. One is that I'm reading this, and our church council will read this. My intention by the end of the first quarter is to have an adaptive church and adaptive leadership action plan. I don't know enough to know what I need to do. I have to find out. So council's going to read this. We're going to journey through this together. I'm going to read it. I'm going to journal, going to pray, and discover what the next few steps are. And that's all I really expect to know. Like Lewis and Clark eventually realized, all right, we got to get over, and they found the Lemhi Pass, or they were led there by Sacagawea, right? So they knew that next step. Like, that's all I'm looking for is our Lemhi Pass. What are some pathways for us through the world in front of us? Our finance committee is going to be reading and kind of discussing and working through a book called The Coming Economic Revolution, and it's on churches and funding ministry. How we fund ministry going forward is not going to be the same as funding ministry in the past. In part because numbers are down, but also because the people are different. Right? Most of you were raised in a church culture, a faith culture, in which you made financial commitments to the life of your local church. I'm going to give a certain percentage of my income to support God's work in the world through my church. Even if we brought in 120 new members in the next 6 months, if they're younger adults, they will not have those habits. That will not be their practice. Younger generations do not have the kind of resources or the kind of giving practices and habits that most of you do. Like, that's part of the landscape of the world in front of us, right? So there's some things that churches are going to have to do to fund ministry that are different than what they have done in the past. We'll have to find multiple streams of income, which, guess what, is what the Apostle Paul did. He made tents, and he partially supported himself in that way. That was one stream of income. He also received gifts from churches that he had already planted. He wrote the letter to the churches of Rome in part to get their support for his mission to Spain. It's a fundraising letter, in part. Right? So he developed multiple streams of income to provide the resources for his ministry, and we will do the same. All right, so let go, learn as we go, and then keep going is the third thing. And by that, I want to remind us, again, that our mission is not to save Cannon Church. Our mission is not to make members of this church. Our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. That is our mission. That has been our mission. That will always be our mission, to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Not disciples of Pastor Tim or Pastor Heather, not disciples of Cannon Church. We're not here to preach us. We're here to preach Jesus and to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the glory of God and the good of the world. We want to be channels of that blessing, right? That's what God told Abram. You'll be blessed to be a blessing. All the families of the earth through you shall be blessed. And that's how we serve as channels of God's blessing to the nations, is by making disciples of Jesus Christ, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything Christ commanded, right? Helping them learn to be with Jesus, and through their relationship with him, be formed and shaped in the image of his love, learning to live and to love and to look like Jesus. That's the goal of discipleship, to become like Christ. That's the keep going. Keep our eyes on that mission, which can be difficult when we feel panicked about the institution. I was ordained in 1996, and ever since then, as long as I can remember, I've heard panic in the church. I've had pastors and DSs say things like, if we don't change, if we don't reverse this, there won't be a United Methodist Church. And I remember thinking, and? Like, not to be snarky, I love the United Methodist Church. I really love the United Methodist Church, but we're a means to an end. We are not the end itself. God does not have a mission for his church. He has a church for his mission. Like, that's really important for us to remember. God does not have a mission for his church. He has a church for his mission. We're not here for us. We're here for Jesus and our neighbors. And if we care about the church, the best thing we can do is focus on our mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ. That was easier when all we had to do was schedule some good services, get some great music, get a passable preacher, throw open the doors and say, y'all come. Right? And we just sort of gathered disciples, or at least, Christians, believers. That was easier. But that's not the world in which we live. It just isn't. I mean, we're in the South, so there's still a little bit of that, right? There are some people who are looking for churches. Let me qualify everything I've just said. Yes, there are corners, there are pockets of Christendom, there are places where there are neighborhoods, there are homes in which, yes, there are people still looking for churches who do believe in Jesus, who are already disciples in search of a local church. But that's not the vast majority. It's probably not even the majority, right? So we live kind of in this transition from Christendom to post-Christendom. In many ways, it's really post-Christendom, but the habits remain. And there still are substantial numbers of neighbors who are Christian, but that isn't the whole landscape. And then there are all these other deep changes in the world all around us, and we can engage that world around us, that changing world, with resentment and fear, or faith, hope, and love. And that's a significant choice for us going forward, right? Part of what we have to let go of is the resentment and the fear. It's really just from uncertainty and anxiety. We just don't know how to function in this new world, right? And it's uncomfortable. Some of you have heard me tell the story before from the sitcom Modern Family. Jay was the patriarch of that family, right? And his much younger wife, Gloria, is from the country of Colombia. And they're having a conversation. He's getting ready to take her back as his sort of showpiece bride to his high school reunion. And he's talking about high school and how awesome it was. And at one point he says to her, "Boy, those were the days." And she said, "Well, yeah, unless you were black, Latino, or gay." And he said, "Yeah, but if you were a white guy who played football, you couldn't have a bad day." Right? Well, that's kind of true. Right? The world we remember, whose passing we mourn, was set up really well for some of us. Not all of us, but for some of us. That's the reality. Like, life was better for some of us in the world we remember. It was easier. But that wasn't the story for everyone. So even as we might mourn because it's harder for us, this world we find so confusing is better for some. And we're here to love our neighbors, not just ourselves. Right? So we grieve the good that has passed. Right? We do grieve that some things have changed for the worse. Like my grandmother. I will never forget my grandmother telling me about how if she wasn't going to be home when the milkman came around, she would leave her purse with a note on the table inside the front door, which was never locked. And she knew and could trust that he and only he would walk in the door, read the note, leave the milk in the ice box or refrigerator, take his money, leave her change, and go on about his business. I cannot imagine living in that world. I remember that story because already by the time I was growing up, I was like, what? You left your front door unlocked? Nobody locked their doors. Right? So that was clearly a lot better. Right? So it is totally fine for us to grieve that some things have changed for the worst, and it's also good to celebrate that some things have changed for the better. To the best of my knowledge, we have stopped lynching people for being uppity blacks. Like, that's the harsh truth, right? Like, it's a mixed history. There are great things in our past and some really ugly things in our past. And so for us to be the church, we go forward in truth. We celebrate the good things, repent of the bad things, and keep going eyes on Jesus. We really aren't here to bring back the past as we remember it, but to go forward to the future as Jesus reveals it. That's our hope. That's our joy. And remember in Matthew 28, Jesus says, I'm going with you. And for me, one of my kind of prayer images, one of the ways that kind of helps center and settle my heart in the presence of God is really just to imagine myself looking over the shoulder of Jesus. I'm right behind him. That's not a claim to my faithfulness. That's just a claim to his presence. He goes before us. And so I really just love to kind of imagine being one step right behind Jesus. I'm just looking over his shoulder. I can just see the profile of his face. He's in the lead. Like, what better place, what safer place to be than one step right behind Jesus? And that is where we are and have always been. So, I want to wrap up and leave some time for questions. So the last thing I wanted to say before that, Anthony, is this is who we are. This actually is Canon Church's DNA. I mean, in all honesty, you've always been a church on the go, right? You have always been a church that gathered for worship, grew in love, gave to bless, went to serve. Like, when have you not been engaged in your community? You know, so part of what we'll do, yes, we'll look for opportunities to invite the community into our church, but we will also, as you always have, look for opportunities to get our church out into our community. We're attractional and missional, drawing the world to the church and sending the church to the world. Attractional and missional at the same time. This is who you have been. This is who you are. It is who we will be. We'll do some new things, though. We'll go in some ways we haven't gone. And we'll probably invite people to some things we haven't done. Like, that's just part of it. Like, there's a lot I don't know. So, like, your big takeaway from this morning might be, yeah, our pastor knows nothing. That's all I got to offer at this point, but I'm willing to learn. Right? But this is who you are. This is who we have been. It is who we will be. The church at its best, Canon at its best, has always been a core of discovery. I can't tell you how often since I've gotten here I've asked, well, what have you done? Like, you know, pastors always ask that question, coming up on like the first Christmas, first Easter, first Pentecost, first summer, whatever. What have you done? The answer I always get here is lots of things. There's no one thing you've always done. There are lots of things you have tried. Some things have worked, others not so much. Some you've repeated for a season and then kind of let go and moved on to other things. Like, what an awesome thing to know about this church. Like, you have been a core of discovery. So we're just going to be us in some new ways. All right, preachers love to hear themselves talk. I'm going to stop talking and see what comments or questions you have, and we do have a microphone so you all can be heard.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to take the liberty of bringing your analogy full circle, and that is to say that as appalled as Lewis and Clark were when they saw the mountains, it wasn't many generations beyond that we had a transcontinental railroad. And it wasn't many generations past that we had transcontinental airline flights that are most of the time on schedule. And the difference is that people stopped looking for rivers and they started looking for a way to get from one coast to the other. And as soon as they started looking for the right thing, they were able to discover solutions. Now, Lewis and Clark had no idea what that solution is, just like maybe most of us have no idea what that solution is, but that didn't matter. We got a solution.
Wow. Yeah. Mike, that is wonderful, and that's also a great invitation for us to stop and really celebrate part of the genius of the American spirit, right? That is part of what it has meant to be church here, right? That is part of the lay of this land, is that, Christian or not, the people among whom, like, there's been that restless creativity, that unwillingness to take no for an answer. We'll figure it out. We'll find a way. And so that's part of what's great about being church here. Carolyn.
Another interesting parallel that you might look at as you're trying to figure out sort of the lay of the land and different strategies that have been effective is among professional associations. For whatever reason, they've also been experiencing gradual decline. I think that older members have different values and a different way of engaging with those societies than younger members. Our younger members tend to be more transactional, more subscription service. If you think about the difference between being a cable customer versus a Hulu customer. So we started to think about that. Anyway, there's a more literature coming out there too, and I just thought it'd be good to expand our horizons. I know there's a lot being written, I think, and done on church leadership and growth in this world, but sometimes it's nice to look outside for other creative ideas.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that is certainly everywhere, right? Younger generations tend not to be in a rush to commit to institutions, but to affinity groups and to causes, and with some escape clauses, right? Temporary. Others, comments or questions? Greg.
So the Methodist Church, there we go.
Yeah.
So the Methodist Church did some experimenting right before the pandemic started. Some Methodist churches had lost 50% of their members because of changes in neighborhoods, and so they created some churches which did not say the United Methodist Church, like the Net, down the road, and several like that. How has that impacted, those communities, those churches? Were those kind of things successful then or now?
So that's a trend that goes back a little ways. Like, I was very aware when I got here that the website, most of the print material, most of the conversation refers to this church as Canon Church, not Canon United Methodist Church, right? So that became kind of a thing. It actually got started, in my mind, kind of in the 90s. That became an increasing trend for churches in denominations as denominational kind of loyalty declined, and actually became a turnoff for some. They began to rebrand themselves as if they were just community churches. I've noticed that some of the global Methodist churches claim that affiliation in the small print, but the signboard just says so-and-so community church. I don't really know for sure. I think it's kind of a mixed bag. Adam Hamilton, most of you know of him. He pastors Church of the Resurrection. It's the largest United Methodist church in the United States. He went against trend when he planted that church in the early 90s and has always been the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. they put that identity front and center. And they put the cross and the flame, like on their facility when they built their first church. It's one of those things that I think local conditions kind of determine whether or not that works or not. With the Net, he was deliberate about founding a multilingual, multi-ethnic church. I can't remember what Net stands for. It's nations something, I can't remember. But it's basically, it was planted to be a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multilingual church. And so he wanted to front that identity. So I've kind of wrestled with whether to keep referring to us as Canon Church or to embrace Canon United Methodist Church, because I'm not embarrassed by that identity. That's not a negative for me. And I think to a certain extent, in the context of our splintering and separation and sorting, it might be helpful just to say we are a United Methodist Church. And some of you have heard me say that although as a denomination we are aging, and so we have that challenge, I believe, ironically, that our faith from the 1700s is perfectly suited for life in this post-Christendom world for multiple reasons. So part of me wants to really embrace that identity. I don't think people usually do it when they either think denominations in general are a turnoff or their denomination in particular has become a negative. I noticed that Snellville Baptist no longer claims Baptist in their name, right? Because they believe that for them in this particular season in the life of their church, to proclaim their Southern Baptist affiliation is going to turn off more people than it pulls in, so it's a negative. So, I'm not a hardliner about any of that. I think in some settings, if it's helpful to be Canon Church, if in a particular season of the life of our church, if Canon Church helps us reach more and more of our neighbors, great. If proclaiming our United Methodist identity, claiming that openly, and just routinely referring to ourselves as Canon UMC, if that really serves the mission of God in this community through our church, then let's do that. But it's never going to be about hiding it. It's just a question of what's the introduction. What's kind of greets people first. We're going to have to wrap up. Let me see if there are any other comments or questions.
Now, regarding the Baptist church, the large one in Snellville no longer says Baptist. Yeah. So I'm thinking, nobody's just going to come to this church because they're walking by. Because of where our location is, and physically we're way off the street. This is an intention to come into this sanctuary. So I started thinking, but we have the blessing of this off-ramp. So where our mission field might be is where all the on-ramps are along the Reagan, and hitting all those, because then they can be here in 5 to 7 minutes and drive right in. But then that's one idea. Do we have a plan to have a brainstorming here at the church to come in with a bunch of ideas and see what we can do to making disciples of Jesus Christ through this facility?
Yeah, that's a great observation and great question. So yes, that's part of the journey that Church Council will go through, I'll go through, staff will go through in terms of getting a deeper knowledge of the neighborhood as it now exists. When I say neighborhood, my first focus is the Brookwood cluster. I know that our members come from beyond the Brookwood cluster, and will keep coming from beyond the Brookwood cluster, but to narrow our focus to the neighbors we're trying to reach, we got to start where we are, physically. This is a gathering point for us, so we'll start there and work outward, sort of Brookwood and surrounding communities, but get a deeper knowledge of the neighborhood, who's here, and what are they already looking for. They may, as Pastor Heather has commented, they may not be looking for a church, but they are looking for hope. They are looking for peace. They are looking for joy. Where are they looking for those things? So what are some opportunities for us to connect with people on the journeys that they're already on, the places they're already going to? That's a big part of it. The other thing is, ironically, when there's all this emphasis on getting the church into the community, think about where we're located and how many people do stop at the light or drive by the church in this community. Like, we actually physically are incredibly well positioned to be very visible So how do we leverage that location? They're not going to walk here, but they drive by here every day. A lot of people, right? So that is a location that needs to be better leveraged. How do we engage our community because of our location? You know, we're not off in the woods somewhere. We're right here with all these people going by us. So, all right, I'm going to have to pray us out so we can move on. I've got an appointment at 11 o'clock. Hopefully all of you do too. And there's coffee and donuts waiting for us in the connector. Let me offer a word of prayer, and then we'll scatter before we regather. God, once again, you have been our dwelling place in every generation. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We give thanks that you walk us through every dark valley, up every mountain, across every river, calling us onward, leading us onward from the world as it is toward the world as it will be, the world as we see it revealed in Jesus. We give you thanks that your Son goes before us, promises to walk with us, to lead us, to guide us, to empower us by his Spirit. God, we claim the adventure, the excitement in the midst of the uncertainty and the anxiety. We offer ourselves to you and your mission in the world through your church. In Jesus' name, amen.